a former Special Forces soldier, with a dishonorable discharge that wasn't hers to own. That's how Major Conrad Hess introduced Amara Solis to the boardroom. Not by name, not by rank, by the thing he thought would end her before she even started. Amara had driven 4 hours from Thunder Bay to Toronto in November, in a rental car with a heater that worked only on the passenger side. She had her portfolio in a folder she'd bought at a Staples in Sudbury, because the original one got soaked when her bag fell into a puddle outside the highway rest stop. She had coffee stains on her sleeve from the drive, and she hadn't slept properly in 3 days. And she sat down in that boardroom at Hess Strategic Consulting like she owned the chair. She didn't know Conrad Hess had already made his decision before she walked in. Most people, when they're about to be humiliated in a room full of their peers, don't know it's coming. That's the thing about powerful men who've spent 30 years deciding who gets to rise and who gets buried. They've gotten very good at making it look like a process, like fairness, like they gave you a real shot. Hess ran the most respected private security and risk consultancy in Ontario. Government contracts, multinational clients, a roster of former RCMP commissioners and retired generals who lent the firm their names for a very comfortable annual retainer. He'd built it from nothing after leaving the Canadian Armed Forces in 2003. And he spoke about that origin story the way people talk about surviving a war, like it had cost him something no one else could understand. He did not think Amara Solis had cost anything yet. He looked at her the way people look at a door-to-door salesperson who's gotten further into the house than expected. Polite, patient, waiting for the moment he could close it. There were 6 people in that room. 2 partners, a senior analyst named Bridget, who had the specific tired energy of someone who had watched this particular performance from Hess many times before, a junior consultant who kept his eyes on his laptop, and a man named Douglas Fenn, who was Hess's oldest friend and said almost nothing during the entire meeting, which turned out to matter later. Hess started professionally enough. He asked Amara about her background. She told him, 8 years with the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, 2 overseas deployments, a specialization in threat assessment and tactical risk analysis, and then 3 years consulting independently for resource companies operating in conflict-adjacent regions in West Africa and Central America. She had a graduate degree in security studies from Royal Military College. She spoke 3 languages. Hess listened with the expression of a man who had already heard everything he needed to hear and found it insufficient. "The discharge," he said. "Not a question." "Honorable," Amara said. Hess made a small sound. Not agreement, not disagreement. The sound a person makes when they've decided the paperwork doesn't match what they already believe. "We've done some background," he said. "There was an incident, 2019. Fort Petawawa. There was a review," Amara said. "It was completed. The finding was in my favor." "The finding," Hess repeated, the way lawyers repeat things they want the jury to notice. "A finding isn't the same as a clean record." Bridget shifted in her chair. The junior consultant stopped typing. What Amara did not do was flinch. She had deployed twice to places where the wrong move in the wrong second ended lives. She had spent 8 years in environments specifically designed to test whether you would break under pressure. She had been the only black woman in more rooms than she could count, and she had watched men like Conrad Hess make the exact same calculation in the exact same way. The pause before saying her name, the way they held her credentials a beat too long, the particular brand of skepticism reserved for people whose excellence hadn't yet been permitted to become undeniable, and she had learned, with the discipline of someone who had trained her body to function on 4 hours of sleep at high altitude, exactly how to sit still inside it. "The finding was in my favor," she said again, evenly. "If you'd like the documentation, I have it here." Hess waved a hand like she'd offered him a receipt for something he hadn't bought. "Let's move on." He passed her a file folder. Inside was a scenario brief. Hess explained it as a standard assessment exercise, something they used with all senior candidates to evaluate analytical judgment. A risk assessment case study based on a real client situation. A Canadian mining company with operations near the Ghanaian border. A deteriorating local security situation. 3 contractors missing. Ghanaian government relations complicated by an unrelated diplomatic incident, and the clock moving. He told her she had 15 minutes to prepare a response framework and present it to the room. Amara looked at the file. She looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked up at Hess. "I've worked this specific situation," she said. Hess smiled for the first time, not warmly. "It's a fictional scenario. The company name is fictional. The situation isn't." She tapped the second page. "This is the Brong Ahafo corridor, late 2021. 2 of the missing contractors were later found at a checkpoint outside Techiman. The third had crossed into the Bono East region voluntarily. He'd made a separate arrangement with a local intermediary. The Ghanaian government's complication wasn't diplomatic. It was electoral. The regional minister had just lost a vote of confidence internally and was using the contractor's situation to buy time with the opposition." The room was quiet. "The standard framework response in this scenario," Amara continued, "is to initiate formal diplomatic channels and request consular support, which is what 3 of your competitors would tell you. It delays resolution by 10 to 14 days minimum and elevates the profile of the situation to a point where the third contractor's voluntary movement becomes a legal liability for the company. The correct response is to move quietly, establish contact through the intermediary who facilitated the third contractor's movement, because he's also the link to the other 2, and resolve all 3 extractions before the electoral window closes, which in this case was 72 hours. She closed the folder. "That's not in your scenario brief," she said, "because whoever wrote this brief didn't know the electoral component. They were working from the public record. But the public record of that situation is incomplete." Hess's smile had not moved, but something behind it had shifted, the way ice shifts over water in early April. No visible crack, but something underneath that wasn't solid anymore. "How do you know about the electoral component?" he asked. "Because I was there," Amara said. She had not planned to say it that way. It came out simply, the way true things sometimes do when you've stopped performing patience for the benefit of people who haven't earned it. Douglas Fenn, who had said almost nothing for the entire meeting, put down his pen. There is a specific kind of silence that falls in a room when someone has just said something that changes the shape of everything that came before it. It's not the silence of shock. It's more like the silence of recalibration. The moment where everyone in the room has to quietly revise their internal map. Hess said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "That situation is not public knowledge." "No," Amara said. "It isn't." "We had a team on that file," Hess said slowly. "For 4 months, we recommended the diplomatic channel approach." "I know," Amara said. "Your team's report came across my desk in a contractor capacity. I flagged the gap. The client didn't follow your recommendation." Another silence. "They followed yours," Douglas Fenn said. It wasn't a question. Amara turned to him. "They followed mine." Fenn looked at Hess. Just looked at him without expression, the way old friends communicate in the language of things they don't need to say out loud. Hess picked up her file folder again. He opened it to the back pages, where her independent client references were listed. There were 11 names. 2 of them were names everyone in the room recognized. One of them was a sitting federal cabinet minister. Here's the thing about powerful men who have decided the outcome of a room before it starts. The decision isn't actually about the evidence. It never was. The evidence is just the terrain they make you cross. What they're really evaluating is whether you'll exhaust yourself crossing it, whether you'll arrive at the other side diminished enough to be manageable, whether the journey itself will do what they couldn't do directly. Amara Solis had crossed worse terrain on less sleep in worse weather with more at stake. She didn't look exhausted. She looked like she was waiting for the meeting to become worth her full attention. Hess closed the folder. He looked at Bridget. Something passed between them. The silent editorial exchange of people who have worked together long enough to hold a conversation without speaking. And then Hess set the folder down on the table in front of him in a way that was almost careful. The way you set something down when you've just realized it's more fragile than you thought, or more valuable. "Tell me about the West Africa contracts," he said, and his voice was different, not warm. Men like Hess don't warm quickly, but calibrated in a new direction, Amara told him. She told him about Accra and the 3 years she'd spent building risk frameworks for extraction companies operating in environments where government relationships were the actual security infrastructure. More reliable than any physical perimeter, more durable than any local hire, and infinitely more complicated to establish. She told him about the methodology she'd developed for mapping informal power structures, the kind that don't appear in any official documentation, but determine entirely whether your people come home. She told him about the system she'd built for evaluating contractor loyalty in high-pressure extraction scenarios, a system that had a name now. It had been cited in 2 academic papers and a NATO working group document, though she said this last part without emphasis, like a footnote rather than a credential. The junior consultant had stopped pretending to take notes on his laptop. He was just listening. Bridget had the expression of someone who had been watching this firm hire the wrong people for a decade and was revising her plans for next quarter. Douglas Fenn was writing something down. Hess asked her 3 more technical questions. The kind of questions designed to find the edge of someone's knowledge, the place where the prepared answer runs out, and you find out what's actually underneath. Amara answered all 3 from the middle of what she knew, the way someone answers, from the center of a country they've lived in for years, rather than from the border they studied on a map. The meeting ran 40 minutes past its scheduled end. Nobody moved to close it. Afterward, in the elevator down to the lobby, Bridget walked out beside her. She said, quietly and without looking at her, "The Brong Ahafo file. He didn't know we got it wrong." Amara pressed the lobby button. He knew the client went a different direction. He assumed it was politics. Client didn't want to pay the full invoice. The elevator opened. Amara picked up her bag, the one with the coffee-stained sleeve, and stepped out into the lobby. "It wasn't politics," she said. Bridget looked at her for a moment. Then, "No, I can see that now." They shook hands at the door. 3 days later, Amara got a call from Douglas Fenn. Not from the firm's HR department, not from the recruitment coordinator. From Fenn directly on a Saturday morning, which told her something about what kind of conversation it was going to be before he said a word. He told her that Hess wanted to offer her a position. Senior partner track, not a consultancy arrangement. Full equity share at 24 months. He told her the compensation structure, and Amara stood at her kitchen counter in Thunder Bay, with the window looking out over the Kaministiquia River, and said nothing for a moment because the number was real. "There's one thing," Fenn said. "There usually is," Amara said. "He wants to know how you knew about the electoral component, specifically, sourcing." Amara poured herself coffee. Outside, the river was the color of a November sky, gray and silver and very still. "He's asking because he wants to know if the source is transferable," she said. "Whether it comes with me or stays in my independent practice." A pause. "Yes, it comes with me," she said. "That's what senior partnership means." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear Fenn almost smile over the phone, the small sound of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular sentence and has finally heard it said correctly. "Tuesday," he said. 10 o'clock. "I'll be there," Amara said. She hung up and stood at her kitchen window for a while. The river moved the way rivers move in November. Slowly, inevitably, indifferent to everything on the banks. She thought about the drive back to Toronto. She thought about the rental car and the broken heater and the Staples folder from Sudbury. She thought about Conrad Hess sitting in that boardroom right now, on a Saturday morning, revising. There is something that happens to men who have decided in advance that certain people cannot be what they are. It isn't transformation. It isn't revelation. It's quieter than that and less comfortable. It's the specific and private experience of having to absorb the distance between what they believed and what turned out to be true, with no audience, no scorecard, no procedural way to make it into something other than what it is. Just the room. Just the distance. Just the revision. Conrad Hess had a PhD from Western. He had 30 years of contracts. He had a wall of credentials in a corner office on King Street West. He had spent 40 minutes watching a woman in a coffee-stained sleeve answer questions that the best people in his firm hadn't been able to answer, from memory, without notes, while he was the one who was supposed to be evaluating her. Amara drove back to Thunder Bay on Sunday. She stopped at the same rest stop on the highway and bought another coffee. The heater on the driver's side was still broken. She turned it up anyway and watched the highway unspool northward in the dark, and somewhere north of Sudbury, with the trees coming up close, on both sides of the road, and the sky above them very black and very clear. She thought about the word the military uses for the moment after a mission completes successfully. Not celebration, not relief, just done. The quiet, clean, unglamorous fact of a thing finished exactly as it needed to be finished. Tuesday came. The papers were real. The equity was real. The firm's name changed 4 months later, a rebrand officially, to reflect a new strategic direction. Hess's name stayed on the wall, but it moved to the left of the ampersand. Amara's name went on the right.